Today we are going to discuss contribution and and the role played by Pandita Ramabai in modern Indian political thinking, and also the way she represented a woman voice in Indian political thought. In fact, Ramabai's contributions have of late been recognized by political theorists and political scientists, particularly in terms of finding an agency in women, and also raising her voice at a time when even the entire discourse on social reform in India was highly patriarchal, in the sense that it was male dominated, and only the reform, or one can say the transformation in society was seen through the prism of male's worldview. So that way, in fact, one can find that Ramabai stands at a very important juncture so far as the modern Indian political thinking is concerned, and also in terms of the larger discourse which is associated with enlightenment in modern India, particularly in modern period in India, particularly in terms of social reform, religious reform, and number of issues which were raised in the society. In fact, we will come to this issue later, but one thing we should remember that Ramabai, Pandita Ramabai, is considered as a voice of women's emancipation in 19th century Maharashtra. In fact, we should remember that there were two centers of modern Renaissance, particularly during the colonial period, and two important centers, and Maharashtra was one of them, other being of course Bengal. And Ramabai, as you will see later, that had the privilege of experiencing the larger social reality pertaining to women's subjugation and discrimination, both in Maharashtra, where she was born, and Bengal, where she travelled and stayed for a long period of time. So therefore, in fact, from the two centers of Renaissance, in fact, she raised the voice of dissent so far as women's question is concerned. So that way it is very important, particularly in terms of her intervention in modern Indian political thinking. Now, one thing we should remember as a backgrounder, that how this gender issue was constructed in the colonial period. In fact, there are two entry points to this gender issue, like caste in colonial period. One was the colonial vantage point, or one can say the colonial intervention, because we shouldn't forget one thing, that gender and caste discrimination and subjugation or exploitation were the marker of India's uncivility, or India's backwardness. So therefore, what we find that this gender and caste two issues were always highlighted by the colonial discourse in India to drive home the point that colonial rule was very enlightening and liberative for Indian people, because both women as well as the lower caste, particularly those who were down in the caste hierarchy, they were suffering in the hands of the upper caste Hindus. So therefore, gender and caste were the two marker of India's degradation and incivility, and therefore what we find that colonialism always used them to justify its rule. It is in this context that I should also mention here the larger debate which was taking place within the colonial discourse itself, and that debate was very significant from the point of view of India's social reform. That debate was between the Orientalists and the Anglicists, the two schools of thought among the colonial rulers and colonial ideologues. The Orientalists who wanted not to disturb India's cultural and social fabric, and instead they argued that they are a museum material and they should be simply allowed to live their own lives, and therefore there shouldn't be any interference in the social life of Indian people. Whereas the Anglicists disagreed with them, and they basically pleaded that the British rule in India had certain imperial responsibility, not only ruling over them for their own interest, but also to transform the society in the image of West. Particularly, West had witnessed a more progressive and more important development in history. So, therefore, this was the Anglicist line of thinking. As we know, finally the Anglicists prevailed, and as it is well known that on education the famous Macaulay's minutes are the best testimony of this line of thinking prevailing in India. But at the same time, we should also remember that outside this colonial discourse, there was also a churning in the society, and this is what normally we associate with the social and religious reform movement in India. Starting with Ram Mohan Roy and Brahmo Samaj, then and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Jyotiba Phule and Rana Day and Gokhale in Maharashtra, and whole host of other reformers at that time in different parts of India, particularly Bengal and Maharashtra, who also raised their discomfort, the voice of discomfort against the prevailing social and religious orthodoxy and practices. So, social religious reform movement was another very important churning going on in society. But here we should not lose sight of the fact that these social religious reformers essentially relied on two things: A, the intervention by the colonial rulers through law and policies, and number two, reinterpretation of the scriptures and text, particularly religious text of Hinduism, and establishing through a reinterpretation that whatever practices were basically in vogue, particularly in terms of women's subjugation or caste discrimination, they were not in accordance with the precepts of these scriptures, rather they were distortions. So, therefore, the entire thrust was to establish the glorious past, and also at the same time the distortions which crept into this entire tradition, and therefore entire effort was in direction of rescuing in Hinduism and also Indian tradition and culture from the grips of obscurantist forces and orthodox elements in society. So, therefore, these two traditions or two trends one can clearly see happening in the colonial period, particularly in 19th century India. And it is in this context that we have to see that how when Indian National Congress was formed in 1885, and particularly the first phase which was led by the moderates, in terms of their entire policies of modernizing Indian society with the help of law and constitution, with the active intervention of colonial rulers, and the way they talked about secular nationalism, separating religion and politics, and also bringing modern values to Indian society. Of course, their understanding of modernity was totally different from what the later nationalist leaders within the Congress talked about, like Tilak and other, who were later called as militant nationalists, because they argued that modernity cannot have only one face which should be universally accepted, and therefore if traditions are multiple, then modernity should also be imagined in multiple fashion and multiple manners. So, therefore, this entire debate took a different turn later within Indian National Congress and Indian National Movement. But for the time being, what is my purpose of mentioning these moderates? That moderates, of course, in politics talked about constitutional reforms, talked about legal reforms, talked about rights of Indian people to participate and represent. They argued for representation, freedom of press, civil rights, and many other things which can be associated with modern liberal discourse in modern time in the world. But at the same time, in fact, it is also to be remembered that their entire politics was not confined to the arena of political as it is normally associated, but they also took up social issues, but very consciously they separated the two, the political issues and the social issues. And one thing is to remember that two issues, this separation continued even later in 20th century when Gandhi emerged on the scene, because knowing the fact that conflating the two, the political and social, may result into certain fissures in the nationalist ranks. So therefore this trend which was set by the moderates was later carried forward during the Gandhian phase as well, but moderates were the pioneer in terms of the separating the two, the political and the social, and the political issues were basically dealt within the Indian National Congress, whereas the social issues were always discussed within National Social Conference. Interestingly, the both met simultaneously roughly around the same time, of course in two different pandals, and therefore the National Social Conference discussed the social issues, whereas the Indian National Congress discussed the political issues. That was the arrangement which started when the Indian National Congress was formed. As we know very well that most of the leaders of the Indian National Congress in the initial phase, as they are called moderates, were also social reformers. Many of them were social reformers, be it Ranade, be it Gokhale, or for that matter any important leader of importance within the Congress at that time was actively engaged with social reform, particularly in these two spheres, women's empowerment and ending the caste discrimination, rather carrying forward the tradition which Ram Mohan, Vidyasagar and others had initiated in early 19th century. But this process, as we should recall that this National Social Conference and the Indian National Congress meeting simultaneously in two different pandals and discussing two different issues, tactically separating the social and political, didn't last long, particularly after the ascendancy of a different ideology within a nationalist rank. And therefore as we know that in Pune, when this entire pandal of the National Social Conference was burnt by those who were opposing age of consent bill initiated by Britishers, particularly in terms of seeking the consent of the girl child for their marriage, which was opposed by many many people in society, because they thought that marriage is a contract, and inheritance, marriage and similar other things are the personal matter which are outside the purview of law and the state. So state has no business to interfere in these personal matter of the society, and therefore they should be governed according to the scriptures, according to the precepts of different religion, and therefore there are codes which are sanctioned by custom, tradition and religion, and those codes should be honored and respected. So therefore this entire attempt of National Social Conference to support the government initiative or demand a more active intervention by law in the state in terms of empowering the girl child, in terms of enacting this age of consent bill was opposed, and therefore this pandal got burnt along with many other issues which were also simmering, and this is how this entire process suffered a major setback. And later on we find that this entire debate got polarized between revivalist and the reformist, which continued even later, and 20th century it took a different turn, when many scholars believe that this revivalism at that time was only in terms of reviving the old traditional customs and practices, and making people aware about their own heritage, and also taking pride in their own past. But later on it took a different turn, and many scholars have held this responsible for the later communalization of society, when different religious revivalist tendencies developed among different religions. But what I am trying to mention here, that this entire moderate attempt at that time to highlight this issue of social reform through National Social Conference should be at least seen here in terms of the larger the male dominance within the reformist politics. In fact, most of the reformers were the upper caste intelligentsia. In fact, that was the nature and character of the national movement, because they were the first ones to westernize themselves. They were the first ones who picked up modern English education. And therefore we find that they were the first ones who became aware about India's social backwardness or India's social or shortcomings in society. So therefore this new awakening in Maharashtra was mostly among the upper caste intelligentsia, and therefore interestingly they were both the subjects and the leaders of this new awakening. They were also leading this entire campaign for social reform, as well as the subjects were also from the same class, same caste, because mostly the upper caste women who were suffering on account of these practices, be it sati or widowhood or early marriage and many other things. So therefore both leadership and the subject who were confined to this class and this caste. In fact, and at the same time we should also remember that it was the male perspective in the entire reform discourse which was dominating, even if their commitment for the upliftment of women, be it Ram Mohan Roy or the Brahmo Samaj movement or the subsequent followers of Ram Mohan like Kesav Chandra Sen, Devendranath Tagore and others, or for that matter many reformers in Maharashtra like Ranade, Gokhale, Telang, Bhandarkar and others. All of them were actively engaged with social reform issue, but nonetheless their entire worldview was the worldview of a male reformer. So therefore in fact we can see that they were bringing a male perspective in the reform, and interestingly if the reformist politics was male dominated, the colonial discourse was not different. In fact we should remember that West patted itself for modernity and patted itself for enlightenment, but we should remember that their track record in terms of empowering women was not very laudable, to the extent that in 20th century the entire process of giving right to women to participate in politics and representation happened in West, and so therefore, and that too after a very powerful movement, the suffragettes, the suffrage movement, which talked about universal franchise. So therefore in fact if the reform politics was male dominated, the colonial discourse was no different. So both in fact the nationalist and the colonial discourses, so far as the social reform in India is concerned, at that time was male dominated, or at least was being seen through the prism of male worldview. So it was a male perspective which was dominant. Now it is here that we can see the contribution of someone like Pandita Ramabai, a woman voice in that period, of course coming from upper caste background, may not be upper class, but that I will take up this issue later, because our very turbulent childhood which she had. But nonetheless he came from a upper caste background, a Maharashtrian Chitpavan Brahmin, which her father was. So, but even in having what is important here to remember, that Ramabai's intervention becomes important because she is the first important voice which challenges this male perspective in the entire reform discourse in India, and starts arguing for women agency, that how one should see women not an object of programs and policies in law, but also a subject, an agency who can bring transformation in society. Interestingly, there are many similar voices in Maharashtra. Ramabai of course stands out, but there are many voices, and one of the very towering social reformer in Maharashtra, Jyotiba Phule, who not only combined women's empowerment with the caste empowerment, in the sense that empowering the discriminated and disprivileged caste, particularly through his Satyasodhak Samaj, and he was a very important voice at that time for social reform. Therefore we find that there are many voices emerging, but Ramabai stands out in terms of the women voice at that time. Now one thing we should remember, that what was the entire theoretical framework under which Ramabai operated at that time, which can give us some idea about his line of thinking, or one can say the trajectory of her political thought. In fact, it was the patriarchy which was a very dominant concern or dominant reference point in her entire political engagement, to the extent that one scholar, sociologist who has worked on Maharashtra in particular and generally on this feminist issue in India, Gail Ombet, she argues that Ramabai's entire concern was with the patriarchy, and therefore at times she sidestepped the issue of caste, unlike Phule, who tried to combine both patriarchy and caste. But one thing is very clear, that patriarchy was a very important reference point for Ramabai. Now, one thing we should remember, that how she looked at this question of patriarchy in Indian tradition, because we should remember that patriarchy stands for a male domination in society, where the two sexes, the male woman and male and female, they are separated, and there is a stereotyping of in all societies so far as the woman's role is concerned, which perhaps the feminist movement in 20th century has successfully highlighted, that how this stereotyping is a cultural construct which starts from family and then goes up in different domain of power. Particularly it becomes more vicious in the power circuits. So therefore this stereotyping, and this stereotyping is done with the help of tradition, culture and religion, and this is not something which is only true about India. This is true about all societies. In fact, as I have mentioned, that West may be patting itself for bringing many new ideas in modern period, and also heralding this modern epoch in history. But nonetheless, its track record in terms of empowering women is not very good, or one can say laudable. So therefore, this is true across the societies and across the culture. But in India, what happened, that religion, that is particularly the religion, the dominant religion in the society, that was Hinduism. In fact, the way it was interpreted by certain orthodox elements in society, the way they interpreted Shastras and Purans, the way looked at different philosophical texts, and the way that interpretation excluded women from important roles in different walks of life in society. So therefore, what we find, that the texts of religion in India were being used to subjugate women, and this is how we can see that how Ram Mohan and the Brahmo Samaj tried to raise this issue. Now here it is pertinent to mention that even on this issue there were two approaches. One was to reinterpreting the text, and therefore recentering this entire issue within the larger discourse within Hinduism. This is something which was more dominant in Bengal and other places. And in fact, Ram Mohan's contribution people normally locate here, that as he was well conversant to different religion, he was well conversant to different languages, he accessed the original text of in Hinduism and tried to interpret in a different way, arguing that practices like sati were basically outlandish so far as Hinduism as a religion is concerned. But then there was another approach also, which didn't rely on this textual interpretation, and interrogated this entire religion itself, and argued that religion itself was the basis for these discriminations. So instead of reinterpreting the text, they tried to take the issue in the domain of religion and interrogated it frontally. In fact, Ramabai can be considered as one such example. Later on, one can see also the similar trend happening with Ambedkar. Particularly, when we bring this Ambedkar-Gandhi debate on the caste, because Ambedkar believed that the problem was not only the caste, but its justification and legitimacy offered by Hinduism. So either Hinduism as a religion is reformed, or and finally, as we know, that his entire take was different in terms of converting to Buddhism. So therefore, Ramabai can be located here in terms of the second approach, that who not only believed rather who didn't believe in reinterpreting the text and bringing more authentic interpretation before the people, and thereby delegitimizing such practices, be it sati or the caste discrimination or early marriages of girl child. But on the other hand, they believed that the problem lay elsewhere. The problem was in the domain of religion itself, and therefore it is not just reinterpretation, but one has to interrogate this entire religion in a different way. So it is here we can see that Ramabai comes in that tradition, which continued even later, as I have mentioned, in 20th century. So now what we find, that exclusion and discrimination which were basically justified in India in different spheres of life, be it property rights and other things, they were part of this larger patriarchal discourse in India happening at that time. Now justification, as you know, was always done in name of tradition and culture. Of course, the Bhakti movement tried to interrogate it, but as you know, that Bhakti movement also had a kind of disadvantage or handicap, because though it was it originated among the people, the masses, but nonetheless in fact it couldn't take that discourse any further. So in fact, what we see, that this enlightenment in modern India at that time, many people associate this enlightenment with the Bhakti movement. Many people associate enlightenment with this modern Renaissance, which normally is associated with the advent of modern education and modern values, particularly in during colonial period. But nonetheless, enlightenment marked this important moment so far as this entire reformism discourse is concerned. Of course, as I have mentioned earlier, that there also resulted a debate between this reformism and revivalism, and therefore later on this revivalism became a kind of more dominant idea against reformism. So therefore, colonial intervention in this sense was highly controversial. Now Partha Chatterjee has made a very perceptive observation, that the for nationalists, in fact, they, when even if they were expecting the colonial intervention, they always separated this entire thing into two domains, the material and spiritual or cultural, and they always argued for this cultural sphere to be kept autonomous without having any interference by the colonial rulers. Whatever interference they invited, they were mostly in material domain, where they never hesitated in inviting the colonial intervention through law and state. But in cultural sphere, they wanted full autonomy, or they considered it a sovereign domain. And it is here the revivalists opposed law like Age of Consent Bill and many other bills, because they thought that it was a cultural sphere, the inner sphere, and in inner sphere the law and state have no role. This is a matter of society, this is a matter of culture. So therefore, what Chatterjee observes about these two domains can be seen in terms of the entire opposition at that time between revivalism and reformism. Now it is in this sense that we have to see that how Ramabai comes out as a very powerful voice in this entire freedom movement, entire social reform movement. Thank you.